Today, we're really zooming in on something fundamental to the American landscape, the suburbs. Our goal here is to kind of unpack how the suburban lifestyle, from its start in the post-war boom right up to today, how it fundamentally reshaped America's political and cultural identity. We've got some fascinating source material that tracks this whole story, right from the 50s through to, well, some pretty extreme political movements now.
Yeah, and to really get it, you have to understand that early suburbia wasn't just about building houses. It was really based on a huge shift in how labor worked internally. The whole setup kind of assumed that someone, and back then that usually meant the mother, would be home, running things, managing what the sources called these complex new technological systems.
Right, technological systems. And we're not just talking about like a new washing machine, are we?
No, it's everything. The explosion of home appliances, sure, but also the water systems, the infrastructure, and maybe most importantly, the car.
Ah, the car. And that's where we hit this central paradox, isn't it? This whole happy motoring idea promised ease, convenience, freedom even. But what it actually did was create this very specific, sometimes isolating environment for the baby boomers. And that led to some pretty unexpected reactions down the line, culturally and politically.
Exactly. That hidden labor piece is critical.
Yeah.
It's fascinating because, as these technologies spread in the 50s, they actually seem to create more work inside the home, not less. Think about it. When people live more densely, like in cities, you had services everywhere. Commercial laundries, food delivery, groceries dropped off.
Yeah, things you could pay someone else to do. But out in the suburbs with houses spread out, those services just couldn't scale, right? Logistically or economically, they just vanished.
Precisely. So all that work, the cooking, cleaning, laundry, and especially the transportation that might have been shared or outsourced before, suddenly it lands squarely back on the housewife. One source makes a really interesting point. Household transportation developed in the opposite way to other utilities. Instead of consuming transport services, the suburban home had to start producing them.
Producing them, that's a key distinction. So the car wasn't just nice to have, it became totally essential. It meant shopping trips, taking kids everywhere, running errands. All these logistical things basically became the woman's main job and a really time-consuming one.
Yes, the whole system, the whole suburban tech setup was built on this unspoken idea. There'd be a full-time, unpaid operator keeping it all running.
And all this hidden work, this logistical burden, it had a real psychological impact, didn't it? Especially on the affluent women who were supposed to be, living the dream with all these new gadgets.
It really did. That promised leisure time. Often it didn't materialize. Instead, the sources talk about a kind of vortex of purposelessness.
Vortex of purposelessness. Wow. What did that actually feel like? What was missing for them?
Well, the idea was technology frees you up. But the assumption underneath that a woman's entire fulfillment would come from being a homemaker and consumer, that just didn't hold true for many. They had the stuff, the appliances, but maybe lacked that meaningful connection outside the home, or the satisfaction of, public work that may be paid. The system itself kind of failed to deliver on that promise of an easier, more meaningful life.
And this failure, this suburban happy family utopia turning into what's called a sick joke, particularly for the kids watching this. It wasn't just unhappy families. It actually lines up with the national divorce rate doubling around that time. It really sets the stage for the massive cultural shifts of the 1960s, doesn't it?
Absolutely. The 60s became the age of youth, partly because you suddenly had 70 million kids from that post-war baby boom hitting young adulthood. They grew up in this somewhat hollow suburban dream, and they just weren't willing to be carbon copies of their parents' generation. They really drove huge social change.
And that huge wave of young people, it wasn't just cultural, it was intensely political. College campuses exploded with debate, protest, especially over the Vietnam War.
Yeah, think about it. Many students were old enough to be drafted and sent to war. But until 71, they weren't even old enough to vote in federal elections. That conflict, military duty without political voice, made things incredibly personal and fueled a lot of the campus unrest.
So how did they react culturally, beyond the protests?
Well, there was a definite rejection of the perceived sterility. The sources mention this idea of the first suburban generation retreating into mind-altering drugs. And the music, the whole counterculture lifestyle, the fashion, it was all pushing back against that conformity. Even the popular books then, things like Catch-22 or One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, they tapped right into this deep disillusionment with the system their parents had built.
Okay, so the boomers are pushing back hard against the suburban ideal in the 60s and early 70s. But, Suburbia itself didn't just disappear. So how did that original suburban mindset, the one that valued order, react to all this upheaval?
Right, that's the next big turn. If the 60s were the liberal reaction against suburbia's constraints, the following decades, really kicking off in the 80s, saw this powerful conservative counter-reaction, and it grew from the very same suburban roots. The sources point out that suburbia always had this dominant streak of social conservatism embedded in it.
What did that look like initially before it got maybe politicized later on?
At first, it's described as more of an unreflective docility. Maybe not a deeply thought-out ideology, but a strong preference for order, stability, predictability, keeping things running smoothly, maintaining the status quo, even if it made them seem a bit bland or conformist.
And then comes Reagan, and the political landscape really shifts. That underlying desire for order gets activated, even radicalized. Reagan sort of becomes the face of this new conservatism, fueled less by policy papers and more by, as the courses put it, raw emotion, grievance, and resentment.
Exactly. He tapped into both the social conservatives' desire for order and, crucially, an economic defensiveness. The sources use this phrase, car and real estate-based suburban hucksterism, which basically means defending that middle-class suburban package. The house, the car, the expectation that property values only go up, that consumption keeps growing. People who felt left behind economically or maybe threatened by cultural changes really responded to that message.
And that mix of economic anxiety and social grievance needed a soundtrack, right? And commercial country music kind of stepped into that role.
Oh, absolutely. It became, quite deliberately, according to the sources, the official soundtrack of aggrieved white people and flag-waving militarists. It was packaged as a product that resonated, especially maybe with men who felt their traditional roles or economic standing were slipping away, factory closures, that kind of thing. It validated their feelings of loss and resentment.
So as this political identity hardens, the physical geography changes too. Older suburbs start to diversify, and we see this acceleration of white flight further out into what we call Exurbia.
Yeah, the data on that is pretty telling. Studies suggest that the arrival of Black, Latino, or Asian neighbors was often an independent motivator for moving out. Meaning, it wasn't just about property values. The changing demographics themselves were often a key reason people left.
So it's more than just moving house. It's a kind of deliberate estrangement, isn't it? A retreat to these lower density, often less diverse areas. It's like opting out of the broader American mix.
And that geographical separation, combined with a political identity based on grievance, well, over time, that estrangement can curdle into something more like belligerence. You isolate a group defined by resentment, and their withdrawal can easily become hostility towards the culture they left behind.
Which brings us, rather starkly, to the 21st century. The image of the suburb has really shifted. You know, we used to joke about the conformity, the Pleasantville kind of vibe, but now the sources argue that suburbs, and especially exurbs, have become a key staging ground for insurrection.
It's a dramatic change. The description uses that these areas are now running on fumes of vulgarity, hatred, and weird bellicosity. And demographic studies seem to back this up geographically. They show the core of some recent right-wing insurgent movements often aligns with this small metro, suburban, and exurban profile, both in location and income.
And this isn't just abstract. We see local examples. One source traces America's first real skinhead gang, CHH, back to the working-class south suburbs of Chicago in the 70s and 80s, Blue Island specifically.
Right, and that example shows the toxic mix. You had economic decline, factories closing happening at the same time as diversification. A former leader basically said the hard times made it easy to blame the other. The initial appeal of suburbia as a safe white space then becomes something fiercely defended when it feels threatened economically or demographically.
And we see echoes of that defensiveness today very publicly in those intense school board meetings where parents are screaming at officials or rallies with, frankly, pretty ugly chants, misogynistic, nativist stuff. The fight has become very local, very personal.
Very much so. And when you look at the ideology driving the most extreme actions, like the January 6th Capitol incident, Christian nationalism often emerges as a key factor. Research cited suggests it played the most significant role in motivating many defendants.
It's also striking that nearly 1 in 5 of those defendants had military backgrounds. So how does this ideology get spread and reinforced within these suburban and exurban areas?
The megachurch often plays a really important role, logistically and ideologically. They're physically located in these sprawling areas, and many have shifted away from traditional services towards something more like slick entertainment. And crucially, instead of just focusing on, say, charity, some preach a very specific right-wing political message framed as spiritual battle. They effectively become, as the sources put it, recruitment staging grounds, merging geographic isolation with a unifying, often combative worldview.
So let's try and tie this all together. We started with this post-war dream of suburban comfort and convenience. But this deep dive suggests a real irony, doesn't it? The very things that define that dream, the cars, the big houses, the appliances they created, the conditions, the isolation, and the resource dependence that ultimately helped fuel political division, resentment, and even extremism generations later.
And the challenge now is that the whole foundation of that lifestyle is starting to crumble, mainly due to resource limits. There are serious warnings that the happy motoring system, which basically ran for maybe 90 years, is essentially over.
Over because it demands too much space, too much consumption, relies too heavily on cheap fuel, things we can't take for granted anymore.
Right. And as those resources get tighter, that car-dependent model faces a huge logistical crisis. Large parts of suburbia could become harshly devalued. We might be looking at a future of significant contraction after this long age of expansion and consumption.
So, thinking about the big picture, the move to the suburbs wasn't just about houses. It created the physical and maybe even the emotional setup for a retreat from diversity, from democratic give and take, towards this illusion of a perfect, isolated techno-utopia that, well, it never really arrived.
It didn't. Which leaves us with a pretty challenging thought to end on. If these complex, detached systems we've built our lives around start to fail, what happens then? What parts of shared local community life, actually working together, sharing things, the basic rituals of daily life side by side, the things we kind of thoughtlessly discarded in that rush for a technological dream? Will we be forced to rediscover simply to survive?